handed it to me and said, I found this on the floor, and I've just been kind of liking holding on to it. So if you'd like to take it out of my hand, that'd be fine, but just know I'll cry. Just kidding. It's kind of neat. Just it's a little angel that says you are an angel, and it's just a nice piece of present. So if this is yours, come find me afterwards, would you? I want you to be really honest with me right now for just a second. How many have at least one thing that you wish, one issue, one problem, one something that you wish God would deal with differently? Kind of the way life is, isn't it? Here we sit, and all this stuff is around us, and we wish that some of it was fixed the way we wish, the way we want it to be, that the world's just not quite right, is it? And it sure seems like things are not getting fixed the way we want all the time. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right. We believe in this God, and yet the God we believe in hasn't quite fixed this world into that utopian place that we want it to be. And so we sit there in this place of, wait, why not? Why isn't it that way yet? This is an old theological discussion, and we call it the theodicy. Now, look, that's pretty good. We've gotten two really big seminary words in one day. We did that anthropomorphic thing that I can't even say most of the time, right? And now theodicy. And theodicy is basically the struggle of why isn't everything the right way? Why isn't it, if God's in charge and everything's happening, why isn't everything fixed and right and perfect? Has anyone ever thought that? And usually those discussions come back to one important issue. And we call it free will. Choice. That you get to make a choice. And of course, you always make the wrong choice, not like me. Right? And it's about the fact that in this world, God chooses to act through us and chooses to let us choose how to act and be and react to what goes on in the world. And thus, this world isn't fixed yet. Thus, this world isn't quite the place that God is hoping it to be. That God is still active and moving and in us and around us. But it kind of begs the question, how much is God in charge of this world? And how much are we? And that's the core of that theodicy question. How much does God make us do? And how much do we make God do? Henry Nouwen once said this: it's not easy to distinguish between doing what we are called to do and doing what we want to do. Our many wants can easily distract us from our true action. That discerning process of how to move forward and how to figure out what God wants and what's the right action in each moment is the spiritual life defined in a very short way. It is trying to figure out in the midst of all the things that call out to us, all the things that appeal to us, all the things that seem to be right to us, trying to figure out, but what do I do? How do I take the next step? How do I get beyond just me and into that divine step? And it's not always simple, is it? Because there's times when I feel like I've been right there and somebody's looked at me and said, why'd you do that? There's other times when I felt like I was following just my will and somehow somebody looked and said, I see God in you. And that discerning of where God is and where we are and how to figure out between the two is an ongoing process. It's the ongoing central struggle of the spiritual life. Because we obviously get to make choices in this world, but trying to figure out when those choices align with God's choice and God's desire and all of that is difficult. Especially when we do that anthropomorphic thing where God becomes a human being speaking to us. And we begin thinking that God acts like one of us, thinks like one of us, does like one of us. And how many know that that's not quite true? How many know that God sees larger than just Jim? Than just you? Than just us even? That God is looking and being beyond just the smaller picture that we have. But the immense question behind all this is, though, how does God interact with those choices we make? Because somehow in all of this we feel like our choices are important. And that our choices and our action and what we are and what we do and who we become is part of how God acts in this world. How do they interrelate? Especially when in the immediate, that choice doesn't seem to be furthering God's will. Doesn't seem to be furthering how God is moving. Doesn't seem to be furthering anything but my own desires. Our story that we read today is a great story to be able to figure that out. It's a choice that the children of Israel are making. Give us a king, they say. Give us a king. And this comes right in the middle of a grand book known as a Deuterocanonical book. It's a whole bunch of different books all set together. And Joshua is one of them. And Judges is one of them. It's big words. I'm using big words. And 1 Samuel is the first of the prophetic books, we say. But it really is part of the book of Judges. And in this, Samuel, who is the last of the judges, is confronted with this question of all the people coming together and saying, give us a king. And this follows the period of the book of Judges, which is a 300-year history of this time from when the children of Israel moved into Canaan up to the time that Saul was anointed as a king. And it's this time of discovering who they are. And it's a time of really changing, not just as spiritual people, but as physical people. Because if you remember the story, they left from this proto-industrial place called Egypt, where all kinds of things were happening, and they were mobilizing people in brand new ways and really had civilization stepped forward quite a bit. And all of a sudden they go out into the wilderness, and for years they're out there foraging for their food. And they're not planting, they're not industrial in any sense. They have very little. They're not very civilized from our standpoint. And so Ken Wilber, in his book about the history of the world, talks about how we go through these epics of human development. And that first one is foraging, where we're just picking from the land. And that's where the children of Israel had been for that time. And then they move into Israel and they begin to have to become this horticultural society, right? Where they're hoeing the ground and they're planting and they're beginning to establish themselves. And many of these folks, because of the 40 years in the wilderness, had never lived in a permanent home. And so they had to figure out what it meant to be in a home and what it meant to stay someplace and what it meant to begin to have a community that stayed, not that moved. Right? And so they're going through all these physical changes which change your mindset of how the world works, changes your mindset of how life works and what is your place in it. And the struggle with those types of changes is that with everything that we gain with a step like that, it means that we have to also set behind something. And we have to decide if what we're setting behind is worth losing as we step forward. And we can do that type of change in a number of different ways, some of them good and some of them not quite so good. And this example is an example of not quite so good. The children of Israel say, give us a king so that we can be like everybody else. Did you hear that? It wasn't give us a king so we can continue to grow and be and become. we just want to be like them. And how many of you have made some of your choices for not quite good reasons? Not quite the movement of God in your life. And yet, listen to what God did. This anthropomorphic God looked at Samuel and said, comply with their request. Do what they said. Give them a king. And sometimes I wish God wouldn't act that way. I wish God would say, that's stupid. Do you realize what you're doing? Do you realize the motivation you're using? And yet that's not quite how God works. God does comply with our requests. And our choices that we make, we're able to make. And move forward in those choices. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But God gives in to us. But be careful, because if we extend that too far, it would mean it would be that type of God that's completely removed from us. And has started it all in motion and said, okay, you guys have at it now. And I'll see you at the end. But that's not the God we believe in, is it? Somehow in that complying with our request, we have to make sure that we don't remove God from the equation. Our choices have power. Our choices can change the past and can move us forward as human beings, but they don't speak the whole of the future. And why is that? Because we believe that God is also moving towards that future. And in the midst of those choices we make, in the midst of what it is that we can do to make a difference, we believe that God continues at work. And in this huge change into becoming a king, God didn't say, okay, you made a mistake, go and make that mistake and let it go. God walks with them. And each step they take along that road to that kingdom, God walks with them. Helping, guiding, directing, and hoping that in the midst of all that, somehow this choice that was wrong at the beginning becomes a better choice. That somehow that choice is caught up in the flood of how God is working and becomes more than it could have been just by itself. And God does that same thing with you and I. God doesn't leave us just in the midst of our choices, but continues to be there present within us and, just as importantly, around us. In the other people that we talk to, in the societies that we build up, in the communities that we become, God continues to work in all of those, and each of those continue to speak back to us and reflect that spirit movement back to us, so that hopefully, even when we made that mistake right at the beginning, or that mistake on the second day, or the fifth day, or whenever it was, we continue to open ourselves up to how God is still moving. That's the promise of the Spirit, isn't it? That God isn't just one that starts it and hopes, but that God continues to act and move and be and become. And that's the promise of God, is that God will continue in every single moment to become more and more a part of our lives if we open ourselves up to that God. And that's the key component, isn't it, for our discipleship, is to somehow figure out how to listen in every moment, to somehow hear what it is that God is doing and become that. Because the real question in this thing is not, did God comply to the Israelites, but that because of that they begin to hear and comply with God. And isn't that the same with us? God will always give in to our requests, but will continue to move so that hopefully we will begin to hear what it is that God is trying to do and become. And that in every single moment, God will help us to be able to see that moment better than what we would have alone. And instead of going just in this direction, because that's what I think is right, I listen and say, no, let me just switch just a bit over here. Instead of just doing these things, which I think are important, I also do something more than just that. And that I'm continually opening my heart to hear and follow something more than just me. The real spiritual question is, how am I letting God be present in my life? Every single day we should be asking that. And wasn't that call to awareness amazing? I can say that because she just walked out to go get our kids. But Cynthia does an amazing job. And I want to read just the last piece of that because it's so incredible for us to remember. Listen to what she said. By our free will, we can reject such matters as community or caring. But Spirit stirs. Spirit nudges. Spirit invites. Until that divine spark in our soul remembers we are connected, all in need, all of worth. By our free will, we can embrace complacency or greed. But Spirit woos. Spirit awakens. Spirit calls. Until that divine spark in our soul responds, trusting compassion more than certainty, hope more than despair, life more than death. Spirit moves, continually moving in us, around us, through us, drawing us in every single moment to become something more than we have been before. Spirit moves. Will we listen? This gift is that gift of the ongoing presence. This gift that says God will never leave us alone. It's not just a bit of bread. It's not just a drop of juice. It is God's very presence with us. So that in every single moment, as we take this bread, or as we eat the bread in our home, as we drink this cup, or as we drink that sip of Pepsi Coke or other soda, in every one of those moments, we remember that God comes in that drink. God is a piece of that bread. God is with us and around us. Will my servers please come forward?